The playoff run Nikola Jokic just went on was historic, averaging 30 points, 13.5 rebounds, and 9.5 assists on 63% true shooting. He led the playoffs in points, rebounds, and assists, and played excellent defense the whole way through, all while Denver only lost 4 games on their way to a title, one of the most dominant playoff runs by a team ever. This was, of course, spearheaded by Nikola Jokic, who would win both conference finals and finals MVP. And this combined with his 2 MVPs, 5 All-NBA selections, and 5 All-Star selections, all accumulated over the last 5 years, with him being just 28 years old. Well, I think it's safe to say that Jokic is not only on an all-time trajectory, but his resume is already one of the most impressive in league history. So the natural question to ask here is, where exactly does Jokic rank all-time in the current moment? Well, something I wanted to discuss, so, let's get into it. Real quick, before I get into this video, if you end up enjoying it, please be sure to subscribe. I'm going to be uploading 3 days a week on this channel for the foreseeable future. Also, drop a like. It only takes 1 second, and it makes a massive difference in how the video performs in the YouTube algorithm. It is much, much appreciated. Also, go check out my podcast called The Shoot Around that I host with another NBA YouTuber named Alex Hoops, as well as the editor and channel manager here, Rudy. Again, I think it's my favorite thing that I do, if you didn't know already, and I think it's really good, and it's a good basketball podcast, so, you're only hurting yourself by not watching it. But with that said, let's talk about Nikola Jokic, and let's first just put into context truly just how insane his resume is already at this age. Let's contrast his resume with his amount of time in the league to other players we consider to be top 10 to 15 players of all time. LeBron James, by his 8th season, was a 2-time MVP, 7-time All-Star, and 7-time All-NBA player, and most notably, not a champion nor a Finals MVP. Shaq was a 1-time MVP, 7-time All-Star, 7-time All-NBA performer, championship, and Finals MVP. Hakeem Olajuwon, 7-time All-Star, 6-time All-NBA, no championships, no Finals MVP, no regular season MVP, and nor had he won his Defensive Player of the Year awards yet. Wilt Chamberlain was a 2-time MVP, 7-time All-NBA performer, and 8-time All-Star, no championship. Stephen Curry was a 2-time MVP, 4-time All-NBA performer, 4-time All-Star, and a 2-time champion. But of course, he didn't have a Finals MVP, which was bullshit, but true nonetheless. And Kevin Durant was a 1-time MVP, 5-time All-NBA, and 6-time All-Star, no championship. Why do I point all of this out? Well, I think it's kind of obvious, but I'll explain it to you anyways. God, keep up. The reason is, I just don't think a lot of people realize just how stupidly accomplished Nikola Jokic is where he is in his career, and I felt this was a good way to illustrate it. And from my point of view, his resume, if not being on par with all of those guys, is more likely and more often better than what those guys' resume was at the time. Hell, even looking at the 3-year best for all of these guys statistically within their first 8 years, inarguably his numbers hold water and stand just as impressive, if not more, than all of these guys' numbers, and depending on what you value, he could arguably have the most impressive numbers here. Now, I obviously specifically chose a lot of players who didn't do a ton of winning in their career, and that is partially by circumstance. Magic Johnson had 4 rings by the end of his 8th season. Tim Duncan had 3. MJ had 2 rings and Finals MVPs. He was a 3-time MVP, a 6-time All-NBA performer, an 8-time All-Star, not to mention a Defensive Player of the Year and 6-time scoring champion, all by the end of his 8th season. Like, Jesus Christ, man, it's almost like this guy's the greatest of all time or something. But looking against the field, for the trajectory that Jokic is currently on, he's well on his way towards a top 10 resume in the history of this sport. And me personally, the way that I value all-time rankings is pretty heavily predicated on the resume. Of course, there are exceptions and circumstances to take into consideration, because, you know, like LeBron doesn't have an amazing amount of championships. 4 is still pretty good, but, you know, if I was super duper oriented specifically to resumes, he would probably be lower than he is, which is he's no worse than the second best player of all time. But of course, being on this trajectory to be in that category is not the same as being in that category right now, and that's the answer I truly wanted to get to in this video. All of the players that I mentioned went on to do even more and buff their resumes, and subsequently they are still a decent bit ahead of Nikola Jokic all time, if not substantially ahead. And while I have the utmost confidence in Jokic's ability to do that as well, to match their resumes as his career goes along, hasn't happened yet. So what we're going to do to kind of get an idea of where he is right now is we're going to take a look at my terrible top 50 all-time list, and then kind of just gauge roughly where it makes sense for him to fit in. Now, the reason I say that this top 50 list is terrible is because I put it together in a short notice in 2020 when I was a far less knowledgeable basketball fan, especially about league history. I plan on updating it this offseason, but it is at least a good placeholder to get a rough idea of where players are. Like, it's not so awful and egregious that it's impossible to, you know, get an idea of where these players do rank all time. I did get the rough outline of it correct. That's the problem, though, is that it's just a rough outline. Easily the craziest thing about this list is that at the time I put Kawhi Leonard at number 20 because I was just drinking the 2019 Raptors playoff run Kool-Aid a little bit too much, I would say. And also, of course, Giannis is like in the 40s here because he hadn't won his championship yet. But I digress. Back to Jokic. Now, before actually looking at this list, I would probably roughly guess, I'd say Jokic is in the 20s, like probably the high 20s, closer to 20 than he is 30. And that's roughly the ballpark, maybe like 25 that I would guess. But what is it actually? Let's take a look. I'm definitely cool putting him over Isaiah Thomas, Chris Paul, Elgin Baylor, and James Harden. He has more impressive resumes at the very top. Among those guys, James Harden has 1 MVP, and that's literally it. And while Isaiah Thomas does have a ring, Elgin Baylor does have a ring, neither of them, they were not, you know, as impressive as Jokic to me. Isaiah does have an extra championship, but just frankly, I think Nikola Jokic is a significantly better basketball player, so that more than eclipses that for me. Not to mention, I believe he's only a 1-time Finals MVP, if I'm not mistaken. That's without having researched it, because I forgot, but I'm pretty sure. Pretty sure Joe Dumars won the other one. Now, the guys above him after those guys is where I think Jokic fits most properly into. He who shall not be named, David Robinson and Charles Barkley. He's kind of in that ballpark. For Barkley and David, they both have an MVP. Jeffrey Epstein has 2 of them. One of them a 50-game season MVP, so I would say it's a fraudulent one, just saying. Barkley has 11 All-Star and All-NBA selections. David Robinson was a 10-time All-Star and 10-time All-NBA performer, and David is a 2-time champion. However, not great for one of those rings, averaging 8 and 6 in the 2003 playoffs, and in 1999 he was a 15 and 10 guy in the playoffs, and obviously not Finals MVP. That went to Tim Duncan. So looking at this group, obviously everyone here has a big leg up in terms of All-NBA and All-Star selections due to their longevity. But other than like having double the All-Star and All-NBA selections, otherwise I think Jokic does have more impressive resumes than these guys. Like, I weigh a Finals MVP and an all-time great playoff run extremely heavily in my all-time rankings. That's probably why I got so overzealous with Kawhi. And, you know, maybe I'm doing that to some extent here, but at the same time, Kawhi didn't have 2 MVPs when I was putting him at 20. So yeah, I think I would put him exactly at 22. David at least has the championships, and he was a multiple-time all-defensive guy, which Jokic obviously wasn't, nor were Charles Barkley or EDP. So yeah, I'm going to put him there just outside of the top 20, knocking on the door of cracking that top 20. And if I were to guess, by the time Jokic is like 33, 34, he's probably going to be knocking on the door of top 10, if not already in there. I do think even after this run, I'm not being overzealous here, man. Like, this guy is an all-time talent who can be one of the names when we discuss what basketball excellence looks like in the coming years. Frankly, that's what it looks like in the league right now. I mean, dude, leading the playoffs in points, rebounds, and assists, no one's done it before, and it takes a truly special basketball player to do it. So yeah, that's where I think Jokic ranks all time. Let me know where you would put him. I'm sure a lot more people will play it more conservative than I did, but frankly, these days, I'm just feeling like I'm gonna be honest fully and not, subdue my takes because people want me to be more chill. I don't give a damn. I think Jokic is top 25. So yeah, shout out to Rudy for editing this video, and goodbye.